What's up, everybody? It's Alex, the founder and CEO at Motoroso.com, and in this video, we're going to provide you with a detailed step-by-step installation guide for a lift kit on the brand new adult-sized Ford Bronco. Now, if you're thinking about skipping ahead to the next chapter, maybe hang on for a second. I'm about to cover some important information that might want to hear. Now, it's a good thing we're installing the Fabtech Strut Spacer Lift Kit in this video because this kit contains almost any type of component you might find in any lift kit that would go into the Bronco. It's a 4-inch lift kit, and it includes a strut spacer, a spring preload collar, replacement upper control arms, and a track bar relocation bracket. The only thing that isn't in this kit is the trailing arm, and that's a pretty simple install. That's just 2 bolts on each side, and you can easily figure out on your own. Now, if your lift kit includes replacement coilovers, then you're not going to need to disassemble the shocks like we do here. You're just going to swap out the strut assembly, nice and easy. You might have to mount a remote reservoir. Now, we're also going to show you how to assemble the Fabtech upper control arm and get that installed, and that should be pretty similar for most upper control arms on the Bronco, which you're definitely going to need to do on any lifts that go over about 2 inches on this new Bronco. Highly recommended. Now, we made a video about this Fabtech Strut Spacer 4-inch lift kit, and we put a link to that video right here if you'd like to learn more. We'll also put a link to that product in the description of this video, and that'll take you over to Motoroso.com, where you can shop for all kinds of lift kits. You can reach us on live chat, or you can call us toll-free at 833 Motoroso. Now, we're installing this on a 2.3 liter 2-door non-Sasquatch Bronco, and this installation is going to be the same for the V6 or the 4-cylinder or the 2-door or the 4-door, as long as you're looking at the non-Bilstein version. Now, we installed 315/7017 Nitto Ridge Grappler tires, which are basically a full 35-inch tire, and there's no rubbing whatsoever, which means you could probably fit 37s if you want to, and we plan on doing exactly that on our 4-door Bronco, so subscribe to our channel to see that as well. And if you need help picking wheels and tires, we're here to help with that too. Now, these tires were installed on Method Race wheels 17x9 with a 0 offset, and as you can see, the final fit and finish looks spectacular. Now, just a quick note here, you will need to get an alignment after you do this installation. In some of these video clips, you'll see that the truck looks like it's riding a little higher in the front. That'll all settle in after the alignment. We were a little bit worried that the power output of the 4-cylinder wasn't going to be able to keep up with the lift and the 35-inch tires, so we went ahead and installed a pedal commander and the new AFE Scorcher GT module on this 2.3 liter, and we made a separate video about that. We'll put a link to that right here. Now, this bumped the power output of the engine by 33 horsepower and 43 foot-pounds of torque, and we can honestly say after the 35s went on, the thing feels peppier than it did before, and it's right up there with the power output of a 6-cylinder, so that was an absolute must, we think, if you're going with bigger wheels and tires. Now, I'll put links to all the products and the videos I've talked about in the description of this video, but if there's anything we can help you with, hit us up at Motoroso.com. You can reach us on live chat, or you can call us toll-free at 833 Motoroso. We'd love to help you with your Bronco or any of your automotive needs. Now, without further ado, let's dive into this install. Naturally, you're going to want to get your vehicle up on jack stands so it's nice and stable, and take off your wheels and tires. First up, we're going to remove the fender liners. To do this, remove all the pop clips holding in the fender liner, as well as the 3 small screws at the edge of the fender flare. On the driver's side of the vehicle, we're going to need to disconnect the steering linkage. Before doing this, use a paint pen to mark the spindle and linkage for alignment when you reconnect it. Then, using a 10mm socket, remove the pinch bolt holding the clamp to the spindle. Then slide the spindle up in towards the cap while pulling down on the clamp to disconnect. With the crash bars exposed, this is a good time to remove them because we're going to need more room for the bigger tires. To do this, simply remove the 2 top 15mm bolts on the rear bar and slide out the crash bar. If you got the steel modular bumper, simply remove the modular wings to slide out the front crash bars. If you have the plastic bumper, you will either need to remove the bumper or cut the crash bar out in order to remove it. Removing the bumper is a lot of work, so we decided to cut it out. Now, be careful not to make any contact with any of the bumper wiring for the fog lamps. It is a little trickier to cut all the way through with a 4-inch wheel, but it was enough for us to cut and then twist and pry and break the bar off. Using a 10mm socket, disconnect the brake line bracket. Use an 8mm socket to remove the sensor in the spindle. Using an 18mm socket, remove both caliper mounting bolts. Remove the caliper and use a bungee cord to safely hang the caliper. Don't just let it hang from the brake line. Slide off the rotor and set it aside. Next, disconnect the sway bar end link at the lower control arm using an 18mm socket. You'll need to do this on both sides in order to free up the sway bar. So if you're working on one side at a time, make sure to at least do this on both sides now. Using a 1 3/8 socket, remove the CV axle nut. Remove the steering tie rod by using a 21mm socket. Using an 18mm socket, remove the 2 lower strut mount nuts. With a long wobble bit and an 18mm socket, remove the upper control arm spindle nut. You'll need to use a mallet or a hammer to tap the knuckle and separate the steering tie rod and the upper control arm from the spindle. You may also need to tap the CV axle to release it from the spindle. Be very careful not to damage the threads. It may help to rethread the CV axle nut on to protect these threads and provide a larger surface to hit. Use a 15mm box wrench to remove the 3 top hat nuts. On the passenger side, there is a guard protecting the upper control arm bolt. Use a 10mm socket to remove this bracket and save it. Using a 24mm socket and a 21mm box wrench, remove the upper control arm mounting bolt. You may need to use a mallet to loosen the nut. With this bolt removed, you can remove the upper control arm. To remove the strut assembly, push down on the lower control arm while pulling outward on the strut assembly, being careful not to smack yourself in the face like I did. Now we're ready to prepare the strut assembly for reinstallation. If your lift kit comes with a full replacement coilover shock, you can skip the next 2 chapters and go straight to the strut assembly installation chapter. Before disassembling the strut, carefully mark the assembly from the top hat to the spring to the shock strut to ensure proper alignment when you reassemble the strut. This is very important. In order to disassemble a strut, you're going to need a spring compressor. There are various options for this tool, but we used the heaviest duty version we could get at Harbor Freight, and it worked out just fine. Use your spring compressor to compress the spring enough that the spring moves freely on the assembly and will allow you to remove the top hat. Spray some penetrating oil on the top hat nut to make it easier to remove. Use an 18mm socket and impact driver to remove the top hat nut, then slide off the top hat. With the top hat removed, you can slide out the shock. Twist and remove the plastic dust guard from the shop, followed by the lower spring perch, which you may need to tap gently to remove. For this Fabtech kit, the front shocks will receive the longer preload spacer. Simply slide on the preload spacer, then replace the spring perch and tap firmly to seat the spring perch on the spacer. Replace the plastic dust guard, and then slide the shock back into the spring through the dust boot. Place the top hat over the shock to see if you have enough threads to begin replacing the top hat nut. If not, you'll need to compress the spring further until you have 2 or 3 threads showing. Once you have the top hat loosely in place, then orient the top hat and spring to be aligned with the marks that we made earlier all the way down the shock. It is very important to have this aligned as closely as possible before releasing the spring. Once aligned, completely fasten the top hat and then carefully release the spring compressor, making sure that the alignment stays in place. With the strut assembly back together, we can put the strut spacer on. Now start by removing the top hat pin with a set of pliers. This can be discarded because it's not going to be reused. This Fabtech kit utilizes narrower strut spacers on the front struts, and in order to fit them, you'll need to trim the ends of the top hat studs. Measure and mark 5/8 of an inch for all 3 and cut with an angle grinder or a hacksaw. Then use a file to clean up the threads on the studs and apply Loctite to the studs. To ensure the correct orientation of the strut spacer, make note of the direction of the lower strut mounting studs. Then slide the strut spacer over the studs. The spacer needs to be slanted towards the inside of the vehicle, as seen here. Then install the supplied nuts on the studs and fully tighten the strut spacer to the assembly. Reinstalling the strut assembly or installing a new coilover is very simple. Place the lower strut mount in place, and pressing down on the lower control arm, push the upper mount into place. Then place the supplied washers and nuts on the top studs and use a 14mm box wrench to fully tighten. If you're installing a new coilover shock and have a remote reservoir, you'll just need to find a location to mount the remote reservoir. To assemble the Fabtech upper control arms, begin by applying the supplied lubricant onto all the polyurethane bushings and surfaces. Press the polyurethane bushings into the control arm on each side for a total of 4. Then press the stainless steel bushings through the polyurethane bushings, leaving the steel bushing flush with the outside of the control arm. To install the greased nipple fittings, apply a small dab of Loctite to the threads and thread it into the 2 corresponding holes on each side of the control arm. Then tighten them down with a 6mm box wrench. Slide the steel shims over the bushings on the insides of the control arms and you're ready to mount it on the vehicle. Now before installing the upper control arm, you'll need to install the uniball pin on the spindle. Slide the machined steel spacer onto the pin in the configuration shown here. Then place through the spindle and attach the supplied washer and nut. Using a box wrench to hold the pin, torque this nut to 135 foot-pounds. Place the upper control arm in position. On the passenger side, due to the AC lines, we had to remove the steel shim on the left side to maneuver around the strut tire and then replace it. Place the supplied washer onto the control arm pivot bolt and slide the bolt into place. Then place the other large supplied washer and the 21mm nut and loosely snug. Insert the CV axle into the spindle and bring the spindle towards the upper control arm. Using something to align the ball joint, move it around until it lines up nicely with the ball joint pin. Then join the upper control arm with the spindle by sliding it down over the pin. If needed, you can tap this gently with a mallet, but you shouldn't have to force it. Next, place the other machine fitting into the top of the ball joint and use the supplied reverse Torx bolt and torque this bolt down to 106 pound-feet. Now you can torque the control arm pivot nut to 148 foot-pounds, and then place the dust cap by pressing on it until the O-ring fully seats. Next, replace the CV nut and fully tighten it down. Align the spindle and reinstall the steering rod. Next, reinstall the upper control arm shield we removed earlier on the passenger side. You can also reinstall the rotor and the caliper. Use a grease gun to fill the bushings with lubricant and wipe off the excess. Then reinstall the brake line bracket with a 10mm bolt and reinstall the sensor into the spindle with an 8mm bolt. If you've completed both sides, you can reconnect the sway bar. You'll need to loosen the sway bar bushing mounts on the frame to relieve the grip of the rubber bushings. Then place the sway bar end links through the lower control arm, and then attach and tighten the nuts, and then retighten the sway bar bushing mounts. Lastly, reconnect the steering linkage, making sure all of your marks align perfectly, and then replace the 10mm pinch bolt. This is an easy one to forget, and you'll be really sad if you do. Make sure you triple check everything you've worked on and nothing got skipped, and if everything's ready to go, then you've finished the front and you can reinstall the fender liner and we're ready to get started on the rear. Begin by removing the fender liner in the rear wheel wells. Again, this is a combination of pop clips and a few Phillips head screws. First, we'll remove the track bar. To do this, use a jack to lightly support the rear differential. Then disconnect the track bar by removing the 24mm bolt. Moving on to the strut assembly, remove the 3 15mm top hat nuts, but leave one loosely threaded on to hold the shock until you're ready to remove it. For the lower strut mount, remove the 27mm bolt. Now for us, these were extremely tight, so we had to crank on it with a breaker bar and then use the impact driver. It does help to raise and lower the differential a little bit to reduce the load on the bolt, and that'll just take a little trial and error. With the lower bolts removed, you can completely remove the struts. Again, if your lift kit comes with a full replacement coilover shock, you can skip the next 2 chapters and go straight to the strut assembly reinstallation chapter. Now before removing the top hat and the spring, again, make sure to mark the shock from the top hat down the spring to the shock body so that you can get it aligned properly when you reassemble the strut. Using a spring compressor, compress the spring enough so that it's loose on the shock body. Apply some penetrating oil to the top hat nut to make it easier to remove. Using an 18mm socket, remove the top hat nut and take the top hat off. With the top hat removed, you can slide out the shock. Twist to remove the plastic dust cap for the shock, followed by the lower spring perch. Again, you might have to tap on it. For this Fabtech kit, the rear shocks will receive this shorter preload spacer. Simply slide the preload spacer on, then replace the spring perch and tap firmly to seat the spring perch on the spacer. Replace the plastic dust guard and then slide the shock into the spring through the dust boot. Place the top hat over the shock to see if you have enough threads to begin replacing the top hat nut. If not, you'll need to compress the spring further until you have at least 2 to 3 threads showing. Once you have the top hat loosely in place, then orient the top hat and spring to be aligned with the marks made all the way down the shock. It's very important to have this aligned as closely as possible before releasing the spring. Once aligned, completely fasten the top hat and then carefully release the spring compressor, making sure that all the alignment stays in place. Just like on the front, on the rear shock, start by removing the top hat pin with a set of pliers. You can discard this, you're not going to reuse it. This Fabtech kit utilizes the longer strut spacer on the rear struts. Slide the strut spacer over the studs. The spacer needs to be slanted towards the front of the vehicle, and you can use the lower shock mounting point as a reference. Apply Loctite to the studs, then reinstall the OEM top hat nuts on the studs and fully tighten the strut spacer to the strut assembly. Again, reinstalling the strut assembly or a new coilover is really simple. Place the upper strut mount in place, making sure that the slant in the strut spacer is facing towards the front of the vehicle, then place the supplied washers and nuts on the top studs, and use a 14mm box wrench to fully tighten. Align the lower shock mount with the mounting point, and use the jack to raise or lower the differential for final alignment. Replace the OEM bolt through the lower shock mount and place the OEM nut with the built-in turn stop and fully tighten. If you're installing a new coilover shock and it has a remote reservoir, you'll need to find a location to mount the remote reservoir. To install the track bar relocation bracket, you'll first need to relocate the 2 brake lines. To do this, disconnect the 2 brake line brackets with a 10mm socket and undo the plastic clip at the differential and free the line. Install the supplied Fabtech shim and use the supplied longer bolt on the mount closest to the differential. Then use the new bracket on the mount closest to the wheel hub. Next, set the track bar relocation bracket in place and tap the bracket to make sure it's sitting squarely with its mounting position. Loosely feed the OEM bolt in. Now using the 2 holes, use a paint pen to mark the 2 marks where you're going to need to drill the mounting holes. With the holes marked, you can remove the bolt and take the bracket out of the way. Drill holes where your 2 marks are. You're going to start with a smaller drill bit and then work your way up to a full 1/2 inch drill bit. Reinstall the bracket and loosely install the OEM bolt and the 2 supplied mounting bolts. And with all 3 in place, you can fully tighten the hardware, making sure that the bracket is square against its mounting position. Now set your track bar into place and install using the supplied bolt, washers, and nut. You may need a second hand to pull on the track bar to assist with aligning this bolt. Once your track bar is installed, you're finished with your Fabtech Strut Spacer Lift Kit installation. Now, in order for everything to function properly, you will need to get in alignment as soon as possible. Don't be surprised if your vehicle is riding higher in the front immediately after installation, as you can see here. Everything will settle into place after your alignment. All right, hope you found that video helpful. If you'd like to shop for this Fabtech lift kit that we installed, check out that link to the video in the description, and that'll take you to Motoroso.com, where you can reach us on live chat if you need any help shopping for your lift kits. You can also call us toll-free at 833-MOTOROSO anytime. Now, if this thing's lifted, getting in and out can be a bit of a challenge. We highly recommend checking out the Rockslide Engineering powered drop step slider. That thing is awesome. We'll put a link to that video right here. Make sure you subscribe to our channel because we got lots of great videos coming out on the Bronco and other builds. Thanks for watching.